the sciences abide by the project of the most powerful groups in society. Thus, neutrality requirement is not only ineffective, but maximizing objectivity is the obstacle for it. So assuming that we should be neutral is also assuming to understand the situation of the status quo as understood by the people in power at each time. So it's not objective at all. I have Stanford theories. Stanford theories, which comes from feminist critique, argues that if one wants to detect the value and interest of structure and of scientifically understand the structure of institution, practices of conceptual schemes, it is useless to start to frame one research question or pursue them only within the priorities of those institutions. So if I want to study a hegemonic order, it's useless to understand it only from this point of view. Actually, if you want to be objective, or what's called strong objectivity by Harding, which is a feminist, you should actually start outside the hegemonic social setting. You should actually study the accounts of those from marginalized by the social order. Of course, the fact that you talk about the marginalized, it doesn't mean that you need to finish it there, or you need to talk only about them. And one important thing I want to say is that it's the fact that we should consider voices not only from the hegemonic force, it doesn't mean that I'm talking about epistemological relativism, that everything goes, that whatever anyone says has the same value or is scientifically equal. For example, you mentioned talking about apartheid. I mean, yes, both now people call Israel an apartheid state, and people say South Africa is apartheid, but it doesn't, I mean, it's a fact that they do say it, but they don't have the same moral grounds, or they don't mean that they're equal normatively. Okay, as an example of this research, I'm taking some points from the mission statement of the Technical University of Berlin, Antisemitism Center of the Technical University of Berlin. I can also, in your introduction, you said that, again, you mentioned that good scholarly work has to address the problems in society, should not be detached from our problems. So we should start with those issues and then go on to connect it to the general social order. Clemens actually reminded me or told me about actually that controversy that is happening now at the center, which they think, correct me if I'm wrong, proposed a conference that equalizes anti-Semitism and other injustices or anti-Islamic notions and downplays the importance of anti-Semitism. I think that it's important, you give me, I think it's important notion, understanding, also when Shimon Samuels, when he was here, he argued that humanitarian NGOs, when they start, they maybe have a very nice charter and a nice mission statement, but then they are hijacked and are become one-sided or pro-Palestinians in this case. So beginning is, I think it is important to understand that beginning with an honorable or a good topic or justified topic, that is not enough. You need to go to the next step of also having a good research. And I'll finish I'll just finish shortly with Bourdieu, that he argues that it's not only important what you choose or the beginning of the research, but it's the solution for objectivity is actually to emphasize on the scientific process over the scientific results. He would argue that good science, systematic, conscious, reflexive, and explicit. I would argue that the academic research on anti-Semitism incorporates those critiques, both feminist and post-structuralist. Even decades before they were articulated in the end of the 20th century, the study of anti-Semitism represents strong objectivity suggested by Harding that is making the starting point of the research in the marginal lives of the Jews and their discrimination. Moreover, the study of anti-Semitism gains its objectivity from the scientific process and not from the deceptive assertion that the investigation of the social world can or should be neutral. So maybe, I thought about Marx. He said this 11 and have that scientists not only need to study the world, but to change it. So as scholars, we should be engaged and not just sit on the side and reflect on the world. Thank you.
So thank you both very much. We have time for some questions, and I think, in a way, papers complement each other. And that was looking at issues from a historical perspective, and I guess from a social theoretical perspective, and understanding the study of anti-Semitism. A good complement in your papers. So are there any questions or comments? Okay, Bassam and then Josh.
In the first presentation, different historical phenomena were addressed. The tribes, the nations, and all these issues. And now, in the second study, it is more methodological and how to deal with the issue. Is it possible to relate both papers to one another? And to what extent is the comparative approach is involved? Comparative approach.
To try to answer it?
And how is it possible, I mean, from your point of view, can you connect and relate both presentations to one another? Methodology and the historical study. I mean, your study is more historical and your study is more methodological, and I think you belong to one another,
yeah.
But how can you connect?
Well, I can try. I think one issue that is important to think is the feminist critique on that usually study university is reflecting the social order or the hegemonic powers that at the end. So the actual study is determined more or less by the historical development. So if I would argue, you might argue that those changing in understanding what is a Jew, what is the place of a Jew in our society also reflects what kind of research is done and how scholarly we understand it. So, but I will also take in account the feminist perspective, the critique that this is usually actually not only objecting, actually an obstacle for objectivity. The fact that we only think from the standpoint of the hegemonic standpoint. I don't know if that was clear enough. I'm trying to argue that it is although historically Jews were and the issue of Jews and the issue of Jews was marginalized, it's especially because of this reason we should start from to start our study from this marginal life. maybe I tried to argue that to determine who's marginalized or who's hegemonic is a historical process, and this is how the two issues are connected.
Can I be more specific for Anna? Anna, can you make use of his thinking for conceptualizing your material?
Well, I think that the research Ben presented are different ways of understanding anti-Semitism that are not necessarily the methodology I necessarily follow. That is, Hannah Arendt has, not that I'm in any way complete, of course not, but say Hannah Arendt has her understanding of how the story developed and why are the Jews at the center of the story in the 20th century. And Durkheim has his own way of seeing sort of what. Durkheim is earlier, so less, but let's say Bauman, let's say, or the Frankfurt School or Sartre and the other people I mentioned have their own way of understanding this story, this history of anti-Semitism, history of why we got to the Holocaust. And first of all, my paper did not really focus on the road to the Holocaust, which is extremely well studied. And second, I just took a different, or I tried to take a sort of different methodological approach. I tried to more sort of think less about the breaks in the way that sort of Hannah Arendt thinks about breaks, and Bauman thinks about breaks in history, and more think about continuities of patterns of thinking, continuities of ideas, of images of Jews, and things like that. That answers your question.
I'll just chime in too. I think that the importance of interdisciplinary studies is that there is a...
That was the background of my question.
Yeah, there has to be a multifaceted approach to a subject, the study of a subject. And I think that the encouragement of more interdisciplinary studies and analysis and taking on board various disciplines in research is really important. And, just as a point, this was my training in the UK, where we dealt with these issues from an interdisciplinary perspective, and I think to connect disciplines and power structures and ideology and history and various processes is really important to understanding this issue and other issues. A lot of questions here, 5 minutes, so Josh, then Neil, and Angelica.
So mine is a combination of comment and question, and it's mostly on Ben's presentation. So in the chart that you presented at the beginning of your presentation, there was a large spike in the amount of research that apparently is done on anti-Semitism since the 90s. So particularly in the 90s and this current decade, we have an enormous increase in the study of anti-Semitism. This raises the question of why it is that there is this apparent unwillingness to engage in the issue of contemporary anti-Semitism, and yet there's this huge surge in scholarship of anti-Semitism. It would be important to know what the content of that scholarship is, but I would predict that much of it is historical. And if correct, that would go to explain part of the reason why there's not an unwillingness to engage in anti-Semitism as an historical issue. I talked about this in my paper too, but I'm going to hazard one aspect of an explanation of why there's this apparent unwillingness, and I'm going to engage in it more in my own talk. But if there's, as Ben pointed out, a bias, a presumed bias in studying the topic of anti-Semitism, and even more so if you're a Jew, there's also this idea that if, and then you talk about standpoint theory, and the implication is, well, if you start from a marginal perspective, then you free yourself from bias somehow. But I think there's a widespread presumption today, which is part of anti-Semitism in a way, that Jews are not marginal. Which then raises the question of what is the standpoint that we're taking.
It's a good question. I think it's okay, could we collect a few questions this time as well? So Neil, Angelica, and then Christoph, very brief, or concise questions, and then we'll have to...
Well, I'll try to be brief. My question kind of also deals with the presentation last night and pulls that together with these. The real, and relates to the last question, the issue is why don't intellectuals get it, basically, about contemporary anti-Semitism? At least I heard that last night coming through loud and clear. And it seems to me we face genocidal rhetoric coming out of the Middle East, and we're on the verge of losing Europe in this battle as well. Now, it seems to me that the acknowledgement of historical anti-Semitism can be used as a weapon by mainstream academics who don't want to engage contemporary anti-Semitism. They say, look, we're really concerned about the Holocaust, we're really concerned about Martin Luther, we're really concerned about St. Augustine, so how can you accuse us of being anti-Semites? And the second thing is relating to the sociological paper, that there are so many theoretical perspectives around in sociology these days that seem to be enemies of common sense. And people get lost in these theoretical ways of discrediting common sense analysis, so that you end up with an academic community which is much less able to grasp this than a person who simply reads with no academic training the memory things that come out every day. So I think that what's happening is, last point is that the academics are forming their positions based on social forces on campus. They want to fit in. The prevailing sentiments is what I see as this kind of a mindless leftism. They don't want to bring on attacks, from students, et cetera, and so they fall back on these intellectual tricks. And I wanted to know if anybody else agrees with any of that.
I had a question for Anat. Thank you for your presentation. So you bring up two important points about anti-Semitism that are in some ways complementing and in some ways in tension with each other. So I wanted to point these out and ask you about them. So the first is that there's an ahistorical, theologically rooted basis of anti-Semitism in Christian theology. Then there's this historical process, which is different because it basically says that anti-Semitism changes over time, and also that it ebbs and flows. So there are moments where there's less, there are moments where it's more. So my question is, given the latter, given the historical perspective that you provided us with, what do you think explains those situations when there are outbursts or there are these new understandings and waves of anti-Semitism? And connected with that, is there anything, do you see the Jews themselves as somehow complicit in that there's something that Jews are doing at these different periods in time that kind of brings on these new waves, or is it always kind of unidirectional? It's always being, the anti-Semitism is always being imposed by the outside, by non-Jews, Christians, whoever, on the Jews.
And final question for Steve.
Yeah, I have a very short question to Ben. What is the proportion of academics or authors who write about anti-Semitism, non-Jews and Jews? Counts.
Okay, so it's a question that's actually somewhat strangely related to the previous question. So the people you talk about, the scholars, were so the Durkheim, Trotsky, Frankfurt School, Zygmunt Bauman, Hannah Arendt. All these people were Jews, rejected by their respective, whatever you want to call them, homeland society, right? Durkheim, we're talking about Dreyfus Affair, Trotsky, we're talking about, pogroms, Tsarist policy towards Jews, failure of Russian assimilation, right? Frankfurt School, Hannah Arendt, obviously the Holocaust, Bauman, in a very loud way kicked out of Poland. So I was just wondering if you think there's still, I don't like doing history through biography, but it's still interesting that all these people were talking about modernity, we're talking about the problem of society at large is being sort of put upon the Jews and all these things, were themselves Jews very much victims of this anti-Semitism. I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but.
Should we answer?
Yeah, so you will respond to your
Yeah.
comments.
Well, first, maybe say something about whether Jews are marginalized, whether they're a minority or not. I think there should be a distinction between academically what we understand minorities and what's in common sense we understand, and women are considered to be minority or marginalized, although they're 51% of the population. So like the numbers doesn't mean that they're not dominated by other groups. And I do think that Jews were dominated by other groups. And the second thing, I would like to talk a bit about this chart. Of course, it's just the number of books. It doesn't mean, it's not in percentile related to other studies. So the fact that there's more research on anti-Semitism, it doesn't mean that in general there are a lot of study on anti-Semitism. Actually, I would think not in the rise in the 70s. It's not only a rise it's a rise in academic scholarship in large. So I don't know if maybe in relative, actually the writing on anti-Semitism just decreased. I would argue yes that against what you said that the study of anti-Semitism is connected to contemporary issues, historical issues. I think the example of World War II is interesting to see that when current events were coincided with theoretical approaches, there was an enlargement in studying anti-Semitism. Jews, non-Jews, and I'll finish with that. I don't know exactly how many Jews or non-Jews wrote. I can assume in most studies that people begin to study because they have some interest and should have some interest in the issue. Probably Jews have more interest in studying it than others, so it would be expected to see that more Jews will study anti-Semitism. The other issue is that there were relatively, the amount of Jews in academia was outnumbered their percentile in the population. So I don't know what you can say about that. I need to think about your questions more than I would think.
So I think I'll start with Josh. That was for Ben. I had something to say about that. So I think this rise of these studies, first of all, yeah, I think a lot of it is history. So it has also to do with rise in Jewish studies, Jewish history. It also has to do with the establishment of the institutes you're talking about in Israel that started publishing and writing about anti-Semitism. But I think actually still in Jewish history, it's sort of not a very trendy or very popular subject, I would say, anti-Semitism. And if anything, I think the people who most study anti-Semitism are probably people who study the Holocaust. Would be my kind of wild guess. And I think because of that, some people think that the story is over because the Holocaust sort of implicated genocide and anti-Semitism and end of story, right? Which even some of the Holocaust museums, if you think about it, show a picture, at the end of, establishment of state of Israel, end of story. You go in New York, at the final room, you see the Statue of Liberty. The Jews have arrived. America has saved the world, sort of. I mean, I'm simplifying, but that's why I also think that it's still somewhat marginalized study of anti-Semitism. About your question about the ahistorical basis, and I agree, there is a tension there between the ebb and flow and certain historical moments that happen and an underlining sort of imagining of the universe, which I think, even when people tell their own stories, they think about beginning, middle, and end. So and we think of history in that way as well, as having a beginning and end. And I think Christianity did give Jews a certain role that it's difficult to get rid of. And I think that this role does actually help us explain why in certain periods there is a rise in this violence, because in periods where there's more of this religious fervor, where there's a eschatological anxiety, the world is coming to an end, we have to make the Jews convert, we have to get rid of it, we have to purify ourselves. So sorts of moves towards purity, all sorts of moves towards conversion. So in these moments of greater anxiety, I think that happens. So if that answers your question. As for Jews, I think that's a very tricky question. I think that in some, well, the Jewish actions, I think that Christians construct this idea of what is a Jew, which doesn't necessarily have much to do with what the Jews do, but at the same time, yeah, Jews do not convert to Christianity. But does that make them guilty of anything? No. They maintain their identity and their religion. Does that make them, no, again, not guilty. So certainly, yeah, the way that Jews don't want to become Christian certainly influences, right? If all Jews converted and didn't stay Jews, yeah, probably anti-Semitism would disappear, but that's not a historical argument, if that answers your question. And in later period, yeah, so I think that would be my answer. But it's more about the construct of who they are rather than their actual actions, or, you know, what should they not have the Talmud and not have, you know, and play the role that they're assigned? Yeah, the Jews do refuse to play the role they're assigned. But I don't think it makes them guilty of, or,
So on that strong note. So thank you very much for both of your papers. And I think we're off to a good start. If we have any more papers. So I'm going to pass the decree that at the end of the event today, we were talking about maybe we'll open to analytics for a drink. End of a busy week at the conference, we should all go to the pub. Okay, so the second session, we have Annette and Iggy. Annette will start off. She's speaking, the title of her talk is In Differences, Anti-Semitism in Relation to Other Racisms in the German Context. Annette has a PhD, she completed a PhD in 2005 at the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Leeds. Her thesis was entitled Holocaust Memory, Migration, and Otherness in Renationalized Germany. She's the co-author of a comparative study on racisms in feminist psychosocial support networks in Germany, France, and Britain. She's published various articles and chapters in books, for example, on the representation of Jewishness and Blackness, on migration, pedagogy, and the German remembrance culture, on the writings of Esther Shari and Maxime Biller. She's currently co-editing a forthcoming volume entitled Trauma, Victims, and Collective Memory, Discourses of German Wartime Suffering in Historical and International Perspective. She's worked in the Department of German, Russian, and Slavic Studies at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom, and was a postdoc fellow there, managing a large project examining contemporary debates about so-called German victimhood. So, and she was also awarded a fellowship at the Hebrew University of Fidel Sassoon Institute as well in 2005 and
2006. I think I have to try to talk fast-ish, but wanted to say in the beginning that, louder? Okay. Wanted to say right at the beginning that actually Ben got me thinking, because my talk's very much concerned with language, and Ben got me thinking right away about what are we actually talking about when you were talking about anti-Semitism and other minorities. You did that continuously, and I just thought, whatever happened to racism? Because talking about anti-Semitism would imply talking about anti-Semitism and racism, and I found that quite interesting because it seemed to me that the term has disappeared, and it would maybe be interesting later on to talk about the reasons for that. I think there are good reasons, and the last years I was also more concerned with working on Muslim anti-Semitism and the problematic of post-colonialist discourse, which uses this notion of racism to devalue critique of anti-Semitism. So I just found that interesting for a discussion maybe later on. And I want to begin the talk with an interview with British novelist, playwright, and filmmaker Hanif Qureshi, in which he talks about one of his novels and the reception he received during a reading tour through Germany in 2008. And the interviewer notes that Qureishi's interest is still in London as a world city, a hub of shifting, competing ethnicities. I was in Germany a couple of weeks ago and they don't have any understanding of that at all. He, Qureishi, says. They refer to me all the time as an immigrant, as if I just got off the effing boat with my bag. They'd ask things like, as an immigrant family, are you feeling more settled in England now? And I think, for God's sake, you don't have any idea, do you? Germans have this sense of themselves as a Teutonic homogeneous race with all this riffraff around the side. So I thought Qureishi expresses here his anger about the reception of his person in Germany within the obligatory migrant-writer framework, and thereby brings me also now to my topic today, actually an interrelation of anti-Semitic and racist constructions at the example of Germany, either as different from or similar to one another, yet nevertheless supporting and perpetuating the idea of minoritized individuals and communities as riffraff in the context of German self-imagination as a national collective. And you'll later hear also an example, and I have to say one out of very many, that shows how Jews in Germany are also considered what Qureishi calls riffraff around the side. But before I discuss this interrelation of anti-Semitism and racisms in the context of just a few examples of language about or against minoritized or migrantized people in Germany, and ask me questions about terms if you want to later on, how I use terminology, I want to point to a few obvious questions and problems arising straight away from the title of my talk, or what I think we should also talk about. Well, anti-Semitism and other racisms. What does it mean, actually, to link these terms together in that way, in this succession, and in this brief but still bracketed title? And I think, first of all, we would have to clarify what is meant by anti-Semitism as opposed to, different from, following on from Judeophobia, anti-Judaism, hostility towards Jews, Jew hatred, and also what do we mean by racisms as in other racisms, implying that anti-Semitism is one form of racism, similar to, different from, concepts like xenophobia. And we will have to consider the shifting constructions of blackness and whiteness at different times and so forth. Secondly, those terms we all keep using and talk about could be looked at from a historical perspective, discussing the genesis and development of those discriminations over decades, centuries, even millennia, as we know, or from the perspective of any other discipline that may have and has contributed to our knowledge, understanding, and occasionally our despairing and non-understanding of anti-Semitism and racisms and their persistence. So the short prefix in my title is actually meant to draw attention to the fact that an underlying concept we have to constantly be aware of and also we have to question is an imagined, constructed, and factual difference, both internally constructed and from outside, inclusive of our own involvement as scholars in discourses of difference, and not least of all those indifferences which are so prevalent in those competitive debates on anti-Semitism and racism today. So obviously, just outlining those questions, this task is beyond the scope of this very brief talk. And I'm not going to follow a linear model of explanation, but rather want to point to travelings of racist and anti-Semitic concepts and terms. An approach which I also take because I think it refuses gestures of explanation that imply the possibility of a principle underlying or imposable super theory, which so many of us seem to look for so often. And I'm interested much less in providing clear-cut answers than in posing further questions, despite, or rather because, of the contradiction of such an approach to the notion of our despairing misunderstandings. Our missing of understanding and certainty. Uncertainties and questions, I think, are much more likely to lead us to listen to doubts and arguments of other scholars and to an openness that can provide a counterforce, precisely to discriminations of the other, of individuals and collectives as other. So, scholarship on the vexed question whether and from which historical point in time onwards or within which religious and cultural societal context anti-Semitism should be called anti-Semitism in the first place, and not hostility towards Jews, Jew hatred, or another term, is rather diverse. There's not least the problem that after all we work with a term that, if we want to say that, has been coined, so to speak, by the political enemy. Moreover, there are arguments about the specific anti-Semitism after Auschwitz, the interrelation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, about the specificities, extent and relevance of Muslim and Christian anti-Semitism at different times. Scholars such as Yehuda Bauer, Shulamit Volkov, Chaim Maccobi, and others strongly emphasize that a division between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism is not at all helpful, given that Christian anti-Judaism is the basis for modern anti-Semitism. Despite the new development that shaped the hatred of Jews increasingly along the racial theories as of the 19th century, the new racialist anti-Semitism nevertheless was based on and incorporated at different times most of the old Christian hostility towards Jews. Various other approaches insist on a strong division between anti-Judaism and modern anti-Semitism, and here anti-Semitism is viewed in as a secular modern phenomenon. Zygmunt Bauman notes on the specificity of modern anti-Semitism and the construction of the nation against the Jews, I quote, "The order modern Europe built was to be the nation-state order, and that involved political powers waging cultural crusades against ethnic minorities, regional customs and local dialects, so that the myth of national self-sameness could be made into the legitimizing formula of political powers. Into this Europe of nation-states and nation-states, only Jews did not fit, having only gypsies for company. Jews were not an ethnic minority in any one of the nation-states, but dispersed all over the place. But neither were they locally residing members of a neighboring nation, which I would argue is, in a way, still both the case, while at the same time, of course, having changed with the founding of Israel. So there are manifold open questions, such as, did anti-Semitism actually indeed only turn racial in the 19th century? And what do we make of the Inquisition and the situation of the conversos, so-called Marranos in Spain, through several centuries, who were not safe there? Chaim Maccobi notes that, I quote, "The conversos became the chief victims of the greatest instrument of oppression before the Holocaust, the Spanish Inquisition, which functioned from 1481 until the 18th century. The Spanish converted Jews were not allowed to sink into the general population. In later Europe, this took the form of a racialist theory based on pseudoscientific theory. In Spain, it took a pre-scientific racialist form based on the concept of blood. And if all these political and scholarly divides weren't already complicated enough for the study of anti-Semitism, scholarship on the interrelation of anti-Semitism and racism, a question entwined with the above respective approaches on the timeline of a racialist anti-Semitism, is rather divided too. Or actually, let me rephrase this, I think within the direct confrontations with this question, where it is attempted to study the forms and histories of this interrelation, the relevance of an interrelation for today's situation is often being avoided as far too hot a topic. So instead, I think we entangle ourselves all too often in debates over specific terms and their all too anxiously guarded boundaries. In order to discuss the interrelation of anti-Semitism, racisms, and assuming the always already genderedness of these discriminations, and acknowledging the importance of overlapping gendered stereotypes here, I focus on unified, that is, renationalized Germany, and on the shifting of language and terminology as it relates to anti-Semitism and racism. My focus on Germany must, on the one hand, of course, acknowledge the specific context of the Holocaust and German society's particular post-Holocaust anti-Semitism. Yet, on the other hand, I don't wish to further an approach that entirely neglects the long history of Christian anti-Semitism, which German-speaking countries are a part of. So at first, and now I just start with a few examples of language. Some people may know that you can hear in Germany. So I want to look at the following phrase as an example for commonly used speech, which you will see is both can work in an anti-Semitic or racist, as an anti-Semitic or racist insult. There is a sentence in Germany, dich haben wir wohl vergessen, dich haben sie wohl vergessen. So it can be translated as, we or they must have forgotten about you. This phrase, as some people may know, can be heard quite often by people who are regarded as, well, even non-conformist, but definitely as other in an anti-Semitic, racist, or even homophobic sense in Germany. It could theoretically bear an unlimited number of meanings and may be spoken in the most varied of contexts. The subject of the sentence will be either we or they. When situated in the context with which it is uttered by strangers in passing, in the street, at a store, at a train station, etc., in post 45 West Germany, this phrase, and I can't talk about East Germany, this phrase generally has only one meaning. They or we must have forgotten to exterminate you. Sometimes this phrase is also used like this in full. Thus, they refers to the Nazis as opposed to the Germans, whereas we emphasizes plainly an identification with the German collective that no longer positions the Nazis as a separate entity by way of using the distancing word they. However, in both versions, the Nazis appear as a kind of psychological executive force still existent in the present. So therefore, in order for someone to recognize the unspoken implications, the voids in the sentence, the inaudible the gaps between the lines, one has to understand the socio-historical context of a phrase's utterance, of course. Thus, language is one of the traces of a very strongly expressed link between past and present, and of an overlapping of anti-Semitic and racist imagination. In the phrase, we, they must have forgotten about you, it is the threat of the non-place, the utter denial of the right to an or any existence, which potentially resonates for those who are seen as different, and who are addressed accordingly, through what Kaya Silverman has termed the phantasmatic memories of the past, meaning that memories do not have to be authentic to work upon us. Through her discussion of speech acts and their effects, Judy Butler has implicitly raised questions about possibilities of becoming aware and discussing forms of speech that are not, that do not rely for its effect on being spoken. So this is also a question I ask myself very often: how does one study language spoken and unspoken? What about the impact of the former and the latter? And what then is the relationship between the spoken, the unspoken, and between unspoken words and acts carried out, threatened to be carried out? And when we think about the impacts of words, and I'm talking here only about the German context, the impact of words that remain unspoken after the Shoah in Germany, one is inevitably also led back to what was spoken during National Socialism. From various conversations I had with minoritized women and men from various non-German German backgrounds in the years after unification up until today, I concluded at some point that the notion, apparently, of a buzzing in the air is often the only imaginable way to circumscribe the impact of unspoken words and the subtexts of some spoken words. And I would argue that this buzzing may be described as being one part of the echoes of what Victor Klemperer named Lingua Tertii Imperii, the language of the Third Reich. In his detailed description of National Socialist language, Klemperer analyzed the undercurrents, the changes, and increasing popularization of many phrases of the LTI. He did so as an academic, a scholar of German literature and language, but simultaneously also as a German Jew who was forced to experience being looked upon and treated as subhuman. Klemperer showed convincingly in this book and in his diaries that although not all Germans may have agreed with all Nazi crimes, the most fundamental beliefs of Nazism had permeated people's thoughts and expressed themselves through their language. And rereading Klemperer's work keeps reminding me of many forgotten expressions I also had heard during my childhood. School children in Germany in the 1970s were told, for instance, "It is as noisy here as in a Jewish school." like in a robber's cave, or like in a Turkish bazaar. Klemperer also has detailed how Streicher, the Nuremberg Nazi leader and propagandist, had called all synagogues robbers' caves. And Klemperer notes that it is not, however, either the wish or the exactitude of the expert which determines the universal acceptance of a new word, but rather the mood and imagination of the public at large. Okay, I have quite a few more examples here of language that is used in Germany quite regularly, and I will give you just a few. They're all over Germany. There are Jews memorials, Jews jokes, Turks jokes, and Negroes jokes, etc., etc. And I found it interesting that Klemperer wrote on the question of attaching these words together, the attachment of two nouns. And he wrote, he was wondering, for instance, why the Nazi term Judengottesdienst, Jews religious service, and Jews as in with the apostrophe at the end, was so belittling. And he argued that it actually implied nothing more than the neutral Jewish religious service, and he continued to write, wondering why it was so disturbing to him. I suspect that the reason is that it is somehow reminiscent of exotic travel journals, of some African native cult or other. And here I'm probably on the right track. The Jews' religious service is dedicated to the God of the Jews, and the God of the Jews is a tribal God and tribal idol, and not, at least not yet, the one universal deity whom the Jewish religious service is dedicated to. And I think whilst Klemperer may have been correct to identify a colonial gaze in this term, there's more to be said about the direct connection, directly connecting the word Gottesdienst, the religious service, with the noun Juden, instead of a more descriptive and detached link with the adjective Jüdischer, Jewish. The double nouns do not, in any case, stem from a self-definition of the so construed group of people whom they are supposedly about, as would be more likely with an added adjective. The first noun in most of these double nouns is intended to devalue, firstly, its own content, that or those for whom or which it stands for, the people, and secondly, it devalues the second noun, which it is connected to. And moreover, since subjectivities are hidden behind two words that merge into one objectified noun, any power relation within the so fixated group themselves disappear and become interchangeable. As is pointed out in the Stephen Roth Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism report and Racism, report 2007 in Germany, the word Jew has by now become one of the most commonly used insults among German pupils, and not at all only among Muslim youth. The word, which is not specifically used against Jews, has become commonplace. In November 2007, during a confrontation between groups of right-wing and left-wing youth at an underground station in Berlin, for example, expressions such as "Du Jude, Heil Hitler" were used by the former, and so forth. I have many more examples of those. Norbert Blüm, who's a former Christian Democratic Union Labour minister, recently labeled, and probably meant that, labeled the talk show host Michel Friedman during a discussion about the war in Gaza, "this Israeli citizen," and many other things. And he moreover questioned Friedman about whether and what you people have to hide with regard to a sealing off of Gaza for the press. To Friedman, he considered it as a slur that recalled the Nazi practice of stripping Jews of their German citizenship. But Blüm is by far not the first politician or higher politician expressing the sentiment that German Jews are in fact not Germans but Israelis. The late chairman of the Central Council for Jews in Germany, Ignaz Bubis, was confronted with similar comments during the 90s all the time, as were other Jews standing in the public. I have much more to say about that and also compare it to to language that is used against other minorities in Germany, but well, maybe we can get to that in the question-answer section. What I want to close with is that I think that despite the differences between anti-Semitism and all sorts of racisms or other racisms, only anti-Semitism, of course, ascribes all-encompassing power to a group and fantasizes a conspiracy of the kind we know about. I would still argue that we have to focus, again, more on similarities that tie racism and anti-Semitism together, not least, I think, in order to counter the misuse of allegations of racism that are made in quite a wide movement in the world. And I'm closing now, finally, by borrowing the words of Patricia J. Williams, who is a professor of law at Columbia. She says, "This distance between the self and the drama of one's stereotypes, the distance between the nice internal spirit that is no one but oneself, and this wild image of projected fear. Negotiating that distance is an ethical project of creating a livable space between the poles of other people's imagination and the nice calm center of oneself where dignity resides. Creating and negotiating that space is the work of what I think of as the question at the center of our resolution of racism, of xenophobia and anti-Semitism, and a host of other isms."
Okay, so next speaker is Idit Shalev, and she's going to speak. The title of her talk is "The Psychological Mechanisms Underlying the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and Its Contribution to Contemporary Manifestations of Anti-Semitism." Idit received a BA in Psychology and Special Education from Tel Aviv University, and she graduated with distinction in her master's degree in Psychology and Counseling, also from Tel Aviv University. She did a PhD and graduated with distinction in the research of emotions from Haifa University, and she did another PhD with distinction in clinical psychology, also from Haifa University. She's worked as a therapist and in a supervisory capacity at the Child Study Center at the Schneider Children's Hospital in Israel, and she's taught at Tel Aviv University as well as the Open University in Israel.
Okay. All right, so let's start. We'll start with several pictures only for maybe priming. Okay. So the goals of our talk is I have a few goals that I would like to talk about. First, to have you, probably most of you are familiar with what the protocols are about, but I will briefly mention it. I will briefly discuss it, but then I will go to and start to look at how protocols are reflected by contemporary manifestations of anti-Semitism. Then what is more interesting for me to study is like how psychological mechanisms induce anti-Semitism through analyzing the protocols, and what psychological mechanisms affect the susceptibility to the protocols, because we see that this is a phenomenon that is really sustained for many, many generations. And then lastly, I will talk a little bit about counter-anti-Semitism strategies, if possible, to do that. So, what are the protocols of Elders of Zion? And as I said, I will do it briefly. The Protocols of Elders of Zion constitutes one of the most infamous documents of anti-Semitism. It consists of supposed minutes from 24 sessions of a Congress held by representatives from 12 tribes of Israel and led by a grand rabbi, whose purpose was to plan the consequence of the word by creating the impression of the existence of freedom of press, freedom of speech, human rights, and democracy. According to the protocols, all of which are subsequently undermined and replaced by a mass manipulation and state-engineered propaganda. Okay, so the words in red, again, it's for the priming. What priming is like specific representations that are activated by contextual cues. So I want to make the contextual cues by making it in red, because I want you to pay attention to it, and then we will discuss more about it. So the protocols describe a forthcoming kingdom. Okay, let's, you know what, you can read what is written. I will just talk about the red things. Kingdom, liberal thinkers, mere tools, elders will avoid direct political control, So it's like, and then, okay, I'm just skipping because of time. Okay. I'm just skipping. Okay, general things in the protocols. First, we have the theme of power. Jews try to control the word. Then we have the theme of deception. Jews try to manipulate the word and just, they present some kind of behavior, but basically their intention is totally different. Then we have a theme which is very extremely, frightening. Values turn into mess. I mean, what we thought about ideals and things that we want to promote turn to be a big mess. We talk about the means, propaganda, and we talk about manipulation of money. Again, if any of you is not familiar, we can discuss later the specific protocols, but I just assume that you know, that's why I don't want to waste the time. Okay, so let's first talk about the protocols as a conspiracy theory. The term conspiracy theory usually refers to a theory that attributes the ultimate cause of an event or chain of events, usually political, social, pop culture, or historical events, or the concealment of such causes from public knowledge to a secret and often deceptive plot by a cabal of powerful or influential people or organizations. Okay. Now, let's see how conspiracy theories are activated or spread in the Arab Muslim world. Conspiracy theories in the Arab Muslim world largely blame Israelis or Jews for many problems facing the world. Some of these include the following. For example, the Islamist organization Hamas stated that in the charter that the protocols accurately describe the Zionist plan to take over Palestine, and that the firm, whatever it is, Lions Club and the whatever it is, are organizations promoting the interest of Zionism. It accuses those organizations and the Zionist invasion in general of being behind the drug trade and alcoholism in all of its kinds. Specifically in Article 22, it's not the protocols of Zion, but it's like they take the theme and then they elaborate it, like they make it more literature, make it more rich. So I don't need to read it, but maybe you can just briefly read it yourself. Just pay attention to the things. Again, we have money, word media. We have all these kinds of things, very emphasizing the possible control of the Jews by their manipulative character and by their money. Okay, now anti-Semitism, use of the protocols in order to induce anti-Semitism is not only characterize the Arab world, or maybe more Islamist world, it's also spread in other types of anti-Semitism. For example, in 1997, Asian financial crisis was popularly attributed to the Jewish speculators by Malaysian and Indonesian commentators and some government figures, like some other worldwide, but perhaps more so than in others communities. Many Arabs and Muslims believe that the 9/11 attacks were allowed or caused to happen by parts of the U.S. government or by Jews. Richard Landis, who gave talks here frequently, he still gives talks here frequently, we all know that he talks about Muhammad al-Dura case, in which we all tend to believe in the beginning that it's like the blame of the Jews, but then eventually he was one of the first people with other Israeli press later on that just revealed that it's all fraud. Some more examples. On several occasions, Palestinians have claimed that the Israeli government has used against them, and then suppressed the evidence of such. Some Arabs, mostly Egyptian, believe that Israel engineers the crash of Egypt Air Flight 1999. Others insist that the U.S. is covering up for whatever it is, the airplanes manufacturers. Okay, so let's move on to the psychological mechanisms and how do they induce anti-Semitism? Because if we read, we have the protocols and we see that it induces anti-Semitism, but the reason is why. I mean, this is what psychology is interested in. Why why is it sustained? What is like there needs to be some kind of matching between the protocols and the population, or between the protocols and the people, or I don't know, or the government or something. Otherwise, we would all say, well, this is so stupid. We need to, to get rid of it. But we see that it keeps gaining power. So I just try to create some kind of assumptions. And then what we do in social psychology specifically, we have a theory, and then we try to design experiments and then to study. Okay, so one assumption is that the protocols is a part of social cognition. And then social cognition is basically, I will just read it. The things presented in the protocols make field of social cognition defined as the system of mental representations and processes of group members, which is partly based on the socio-cultural knowledge shared by the members of the specific group, society, or cultures. And then in this sense, this talk is a little bit related to what Annette was mentioning before. She talked about representations of language. And then when we talk about mental representations, then language is part of our representation. Okay, so Jews basically, they have a long history of being prejudiced that has been simultaneously created or supported by these themes. Therefore, my possible assumption is that once we hear these themes, or as non-Jews, or even as Jews, we're so familiar with it. It's deep in the culture that it gave us some kind of familiarity. And then if something is familiar to us, we like it more and we think it's validated, not because it's realistic, but only because we are familiar with it. It's something that we already heard, so we have the tendency to believe that it's true. And during the years, it became a part of the social cognition of different cultures, in Christianity, Islam, and so forth. Okay, another idea is the protocols. They function as they are functional prejudice, and functional prejudice, again, prejudice could be very, very functional. First, let's see what prejudice is. Prejudice is an abstract, general, negative preconceptions of abstract general attitudes towards any type of situation, object, or person. Bering stated that for antisemitism, whatever it is, I know what it is. I have problems with reading, but forgive me, you can read yourself. You're better in English. So Jews are not only heritally but totally bad by nature. That is, their bad traits are incorrigible. Because of this bad nature, Jews have to be seen not as individuals but as a collective. Two, Jews remain essentially alien in the surrounding societies. And three, Jews bring disaster on their host societies or on the whole world. They are doing it secretly. Therefore, the anti-Semites feel obligated to unmask the conspiratorial Jewish character. So in terms of functional, we talked about what prejudice is. Now let's see, why is it functional? Okay, so we have many theories to explain what prejudice is. One theory that I really like, because it's related to social cognition, which I'm very interested in, talks about uncertainty reduction theory. According to this idea, people are motivated to reduce subjective uncertainty by identifying with social group which provide clear normative prescriptions for behaviors and classify between in-group members and out-group members. The threatening contents of the protocols may reduce sense of control and increase uncertainty. Accordingly, expectations of the prejudice activated by the protocols may increase sense of control during historical periods of uncertainty. Okay, so this is a very well-known idea, I think, that we know that once we are afraid of something ambiguous, we look for something really clear. And so if we hate the Jews, it's very clear because it's a theme that we're very familiar with. Okay, the protocols, another idea is the protocol just induced dehumanization. Dehumanization has traditionally been understood as an extreme form of prejudice that enables violence and cruelty. We have in social psychology, especially when I worked in Maryland before coming here, we did studies about motivations of people, also related with terrorism and so forth. So, what I want to say is that we have different aspects to look at dehumanization. So one aspect is that dehumanization is an emotional prejudice, and then we look at it through the perspective of emotion. promotion. Another way to look at dehumanization is through the perspective of delegitimization of a group, and then we can just take it to political psychology. So another assumption is that the protocol is that they are a tool to establish a justificatory system to genocide. And now we need to talk a little bit about different types of anti-Semitism, because basically if we know that the protocols, they induced anti-Semitism in so many generations, and we know also that we have so many different types of anti-Semitism. And so we need to see, we need to match between the historical period, the type of anti-Semitic manifestation, and then to see what exactly psychological mechanism activated this thing. So I would like to talk a little bit about genocidal anti-Semitism, which is a little bit different than the classical anti-Semitism. And I think that it fits to this specific assumption. Use of the protocol of the Elders of Zion may help the regime to establish a justificatory system where the anti-Semitism is instrumental to the attainment of the actor's objectives and justifiable on moral grounds, and hence compatible with this actor's ethics. Such belief system may be grounded in a variety of different ideologies. So basically, it doesn't really matter whether it's anti-Semitism or fascism or something else. It's a justificatory system that once we have it, we can just justify what we did, like what we do, the very cruel things towards humanity. So in terms of anti-Semitism, Kotler distinguishes between classic anti-Semitism to genocidal anti-Semitism. The first related only to manifestation towards Jews as individuals. The other, genocidal anti-Semitism, is related to Jews as a group, the state of Israel. And so if we want to promote genocide, we need to have some kind of justificatory system. We have to have some kind of what to say, what ideology justify what we do. Okay, so basically what happens in genocide is that what the government do is just that they escalate violence towards the minorities or the specific group, and then they need to justify it. So the protocols is the perfect way to do that. Okay. So, and then let's see if there's anything else here. Okay, another assumption is that media violence, activation of the protocols through media violence. There are a lot of this idea of goals activation through contextual cues. It's a very usable and contemporary knowledge in social psychology, specifically developed by John Barge and other colleagues. But if you take it to this line, the meaning is that basically once we hear the Jews are bad, bad nation, when we hear it all the time in the media, basically what it does, it activates the representation of Jews as what we know, what we heard from our priest, or what we heard from the imam, or whatever it is. So this is the idea, to put Jews as very negative in the media and to do it very frequently, and then this activates the thing that we already have. And I say we, not because I'm anti-Semitic, but because we human. This is a phenomenon that could happen everywhere. I don't think that it's really, specific to Arabs, or it could happen anywhere, and that's why it's so dangerous. Okay, Charles said that I don't have much time, so you're lost. Okay, let's move on to what can we do about it? This is the most important thing. Can we do anything about it? So my answer is that we can't do so much about activation of non-conscious goals or activation of these kind of goals through media. We can't do so much because the social psychology teaches us that notion teaches us that basically stereotypes, we can't really, we can try to do it, but we can try to challenge it, but basically we remain with the stereotypes or with the prejudice. But however, we can design interventions for counter-antisemitism, and then the question is who to design it for. Again, we need to match it to the culture, and we need, for example, if we do interventions in Gaza or in the Palestinian Authority, so I know of some interventions to try to promote some kind of peace or some negotiation, and then we can't really, we can try, and this is what psychologists do. They try to do things, and it depends in what catch it. I mean, if it's really genocidal anti-Semitism, I don't believe that psychologists can really stop it. We need the intervention of the international community. However, in terms of primary intervention or like peace education and so, or counter anti-Semitic media, I really believe that some things could be done. Because if we compare it to what America did for the Afro-America, and we can't really make this comparison because it's so different, but in a way, there is a reduction of racism in America. So, so I believe that maybe it could be reduced to some extent. Okay. So I think basically this is all. What is really in the summary is that we really, when we talk about anti-Semitism, we need to talk of different, different phenomena in different types of history and different mechanisms. I think this is the most important take-home message that I would like you to take from this talk, because if we just overgeneralize and say, okay, they hate us because we're Jews, and no matter if it's Gaza, it's Europe, it's Iran, everything, I think it's overgeneralization. Of course, there is a core hatred, but in order to, if we want to cope with it in a way, if we want to do something about it, we need to be specific, and we need to look to have some kind of system thinking, to look at the whole system and to try to design possible intervention either in the individual level or through the national community to make it, at least also to make it to look more validated than we also go with the flag and we say that about how horrible it is that all are still anti-Semitic. Okay, thanks.
Appreciated your analysis of the social cognitive roots of the appeal of the protocols, but and your call for a kind of a systemic approach to the whole thing. But what I was wondering was that two of the types of analyses that social psychologists might use a lot were not really focused on. One of them was a social learning or socialization model, and the other was the more psychoanalytic or externalization function of these beliefs. It crosses my mind that the one that I believe in more is the socialization model. And if you're going to design interventions, you would need control of the agents of socialization. For example, the schools, the educational media, the religious institutions. And given that we don't have that in most of the places where genocidal anti-Semitism is occurring, aren't psychologists' hands kind of tied behind their back because you can't get at those things?
Yeah, well, to reply now. Yeah, I totally agree. I think our hands are really, we can't do much in monolithic societies or in Iran, but we can still, maybe we can do things in the Palestinian Authority, so of course, I also believe in the approach of social learning in education. And I think that if we can't only target the media, we must target the education, the school books, and so forth. In terms of psychoanalysis, it's wonderful. I think that a lot of the psychology, it's like stem from the psychoanalysis. But if we talk of applications, especially not in the individual level, we need to structure interventions that are applicable in the system. But I totally agree that we are very limited, and I think that once there is a genocidal threat, if we count on psychologists, I really love my area, but we can't do it. We must have the interventions of the international community.
I have a question for each. So I'll go first with the net. I was interested in what you said about the first example you gave, which was we forgot about you. And I was just wondering, is it heard often? Who says it? When? What are the contexts? Because I felt it was sort of, I wanted to know more. And also, why you said you were talking about unified Germany, but then you said you weren't going to talk about East Germany. I was just curious a bit about East Germany. But if you don't have to say anything about that if you want to. For Edith, I had a question. At a certain part in the talk, you talked about the anti-Semitism is instrumental.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was a bit confused about that because, so, if it's, I was confused because for me, the drive for genocide comes from an ideology. I don't know, I was a bit, if you could clarify.
So- So,
Shall I start out? Okay, yeah, just not about the phrase, you know, that's of course, since I'm not a person or at least not now working with quantitative methods and go interviewing people and ask them, I can only say so much about it that I can't right now think of anyone I've met that wouldn't have heard the phrase. I mean, people who have native German or grew up in Germany, and most certainly all the people I know from a minority background, everyone would know that phrase. And the context depends, you know.
But who says it?
That's what I'm just going into. I think it depends whether someone, no, that's what I try to indicate with the strangers in passing. It depends, you know, it can be any context. I've heard it in probably 20 different contexts, and I think so have many other people. It depends either whether someone is considered visible, visibly different, then that's an easy target for phrases like that. Or of course, if people, I don't know, make themselves different, you know, in all sorts of ways, then that might be another possibility. And by whom is just, I don't know, whomever it occurs to, I guess. And what were you saying about the other?
I'm just wondering about East Germany.
Oh, yes.
You
No,
know?
I said that in the context of phrases like this, that I have not talked to people about this. I did in a previous work also a lot of interviews, so it came up there too. But I've never talked to anyone about this in East Germany, I think. So I just don't want to make the assumption that these are the same terms in the East, have been the same terms in East Germany. I know it from the West.
Related with this one,
Pardon?
related with another question, I would like to ask you if you heard the phrase switch on, maybe they didn't forgetting about me.
Oh,
If somebody was using in this way, turning on himself.
I've never heard that, if anyone has ever heard that.
that's a really
It's an
interesting
interesting
idea.
question.
That's
Yes.
an interesting idea, though.
You mean
So-
to turn it around?
Yes.
Yeah.
As somebody who is an outsider,
Yes.
to say maybe they to make a pass forward.
You
say maybe
to
they
maybe
didn't
turn
forget.
something around, to
Yes.
turn around like an
And say yes, they forgot
derogatory
about
term.
it.
Yes.
No, never heard that, but actually interesting.
But interesting in terms of blaming the victim. It's interesting. I have two.
I want to answer another
Okay, go
question
ahead.
before. There is in psychology, like we have structural theories and functional theories. So I study motivation, and we believe that there are goals and there are means. And if and so, of course, anti-Semitism could be ideology, but why do we adopt this ideology? Why in a specific period people would rather believe in one ideology, and another period they just believe in other things. So the functional thing in anti-Semitism could be that it's like for example, if the regimen wants to promote one group and to escalate another group, so there's some kind of interest. So that's why it's functional. Or if like you want to, everybody is like are not united. So that's a way to make all the in-group more united as opposed to the out-group members. So when we talk about functionality, we talk about like what goal underlie this behavior or ideology.
So I have a question for each of you. So for Annette, I really enjoyed the paper, but here's a challenge to you. So I think we both have a predisposition, many people have a predisposition to look at the similarities between different racisms. But I found it interesting when you spoke about how Stryker, I believe, looked at the notion of a Jewish religious service, and you spoke about the possible colonial gaze and the racialized discourse on the Jews. What distinguishes the colonial gaze in terms of the Jews is that, and you mentioned the notion of tribe and all that, and the God and all this stuff, is that when the Europeans went out to colonize, they were using sort of this notion of a racialized other, right? Whereas when it comes to anti-Semitism, there's so many layers of otherness, including the fact that the Jews are somehow denying at some level the Christianity of European discourse. So are there similarities, or is anti-Semitism so much more profoundly deep?
Yes. I see what you mean about the disposition to looking for similarities, but I just want to point out and remind you that I've been looking for differences all those last years. I just came back to the similarities most recently because I feel that they are more and more neglected, and I find it worrying on all sorts of levels. So, and as for the colonial gaze and the similarities, I think what we do have to maybe reconsider is that the colonialists, I mean, the deeper on a deeper level, anti-Semitism on a deeper level in terms of Christianity as following religion and so on and so on. I would agree, but and I wouldn't want to say that. I don't even want to engage in this. There are more similarities than differences. I'm not interested in that. I'm more interested in also looking at the similarities again in that kind of way. And in terms of a colonial gaze and the colonizers kind of moving out, colonizing tribes, I think they also very much, and there are a few, not many, scholars who have pointed that out since the 90s, how they also moved out already with a certain idea and a gaze that was already informed by the image of the Jew inside. So some scholars argue that that there are links between the ideas of cannibalism, what actually the colonizers then encountered in the colony is already linked to their fantasies which they took with them, and vice versa. And so in a sense, there's also a bringing back of the colonialist imagination, which is then again put into the image of the Jew. So all I'm saying is just, I think there is what do you call that? There is an exchange, but there is not more similarity than difference. And I just know I want to focus much more on that, on the difference and similarity in the future.
And for Edith, sort of a sense of projection that you have in terms of Christian views of cannibals.
That's also, Maccoby argues, for instance, that this is a projection of Christian guilt of eating the body of Christ and so forth.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay. So a psychological term of projection. So my question to you is, in terms of what can be done with genocidal anti-Semitism, with the protocols with Iran, with Hamas, Hezbollah, there's a sense of fear that I think is permeating the discourse. And as you know, we discussed it a lot, and I think it results in a sense of paralysis, and I think the paralysis leads to denial, and maybe denial is first, and paralysis second. I'm sure I'm not the psychologist, but fear, paralysis, and denial is sort of all enmeshed in the discourse when it comes to the current inability or ability to confront genocidal anti-Semitism in a contemporary context. My question is this: if, in terms of doing something, and this is going to sound politically perhaps incorrect or not very nice for a scholar to say, but I'll say it. If Iran was confronted militarily, would and perhaps defeated or given a blow, would this result in a defeat that would enter into places politically and then maybe even culturally that would affect the dynamics of what can be done and what we can control? So in other words, as Iran is I would say all puffed up, out of control, and disproportionately asserting itself in the world, if they were given a whack militarily and deflated, what would be the implications in terms of dealing with genocidal acts?
Well, first, a fascinating question. Thank you. And don't think I have the answer, but the question is fascinating. I think it's hard to tell because we can look at the case of Iraq. Okay, Iraq was a threat, and then there was a military intervention. What exactly happened in the world? And so the only tool that I have in terms of psychologist is the systemic way of thinking. Okay, so we need to look in order to think of an answer to a very complicated question. We need to look at the international map and to see, okay, who is the father, who is the mother, who is the family, what families do we have, what's going to happen because we can't only talk of Iran and Israel, we need to look at the international map and to see, what's happened now in the United States, Obama, okay, is there any chance for that to happen? What happens if Israel does something contradicting the United States policy? What's going to happen to Israel-United States relationship? So we can't really talk of like a military intervention as it is. We need to see how is it fit in the international map. And I was thinking a lot about it because this is the analogy that I have. And then I thought, but basically the world is not a family. Nobody really cares about you. It's not that your dad is a daddy, it's all changes, and it's hard to predict. That's why we need political scientists, and we need a lot of other areas.
So here's a question for a psychologist. What do you do with the schoolyard bully?
Oh. So tell me more in detail.
Well, if a bully goes, in theory, if the bully goes unchallenged, they become more and more powerful. If you confront the bully, you deflate the bully.
Absolutely. Okay. So for that we have.
Very simplistic.
Okay, for that psychologists have answers. Programs for bullying children. Intervention in terms of the law, but also interventions in terms of like confronting the bully. Yeah. Okay. So on the one hand, we need to increase the self-esteem of the victim and to make him not be afraid to confront. On the other hand, we need to talk of tolerance in school. There are things to do, and a lot of it is done. And so I think it will be excellent if we incorporate the knowledge and also to the area of antisemitism, because these programs are done. Bullying, but I wanted to tell you something really important, that bullying is really related to suicidality. And so it's a very complicated problem. It's very severe. So when we talk of antisemitism, we need to put it in the same package with possible depression, violence. It's not only antisemitism. It's also it could be related also to mental health problems.
What about the self-esteem of the bully? Because that's why they're bullying.
What about him? So what do you ask?
In other words, you were talking about the self-esteem of the victim.
Yeah, but what about the self-esteem
What
of the
about the
threat?
self-esteem of the
That's so
bully?
interesting. Roy Baumeister, he's a psychologist from South Florida. I also work in Florida. Anyway, well, he says something really interesting, that basically the self-esteem of the two sides is the self-esteem of the victim. They both perceive themselves as victims. Mm-hmm. And also when we look at the Hamas chart, or when we look at another, and they have like ideals, and they really believe that they do it for good goals, and they really perceive themselves as victims. So we need to work on like the self-esteem of not only the victims but also the perpetrators. It's like so yeah. And it's a very important point, because when we talk of conflict resolution, we always talk about the two sides. Even if we are positive the Jews, we are Jewish and we want to, I identify with the Jews, but because it's conflict resolution, you always need to see the other side. So that was a very important point. Thanks.
I have a question for Annette. So I was really struck by what you were saying about these kind of everyday language, these phrases, these highly anti-Semitic phrases being thrown about. And so I had thought that the German public, because, Germany, the Holocaust and Nazism originated in Germany, that there was this like ultra sensitivity, being very careful not to say things that are like, could be perceived as anti-Semitic, or there's like extreme political correctness. Maybe that's just because the people, so like going through, undergrad and grad school, meeting students from Germany, I've noticed how many people who are interested in studying anti-Semitism and Holocaust are German, and I thought it had something to do with there's this culture about being really interested, and maybe it's a sense of guilt thing, whatever it is. So is that, are both the intellectuals and the general public using these kinds of phrases that you were talking about? Or like, why is it that I perceive this sensitivity? Is it just the few people I've met and it doesn't really, it's not really representative of the general population?
Yeah, I can see what you're asking. That is a very, very huge question, and actually I think it, can't be answered in short. But what I was referring to was a day-to-day context, so to speak. I'm not talking about university, which I don't know at the moment how it is there. But I think what you shouldn't confuse is, or what, in my point of view, especially since the 90s, people increasingly confuse is the publicized discourse of a certain strata, that is the political elite, etc., the public statements, and what is happening on the ground in the sense of what is the transference of familial memory, what are the narratives that are, what is being talked about. And for a long time it was anyway the case that it was maintained that there was no talking about anything in families, and there has been research, especially in the last 10 years, very good research that actually showed by interviewing a huge number of people, different generations of families, it actually has been shown that this is not at all the case, but it was just not the kind of discourse that maybe the international, I don't know, public or whoever in other countries had hoped for. Just that there was something different transferred. And of course you're right that there may be, as for the study and interest in anti-Semitism, there may be all sorts of, there may be a genuine interest, there may be guilt feelings, a mix of all of that. And then I also think there is, there's more to say about it. Could go on forever.
Okay, so we'll collect the two questions and we have to take a break soon. So Suzanne and Ursula.
I'm also coming from Germany, and I'm a question to Annette, because I'm just wondering. Yeah, you're saying a lot about this. You want to go to the similarities against racism and anti-Semitism, but now you haven't enough time to bring your examples, and so it was a little bit without I don't know, without examples, and it's really hard to discuss this, but on the context of this symposium and on the lecture from Edith, and once you say anti-Semitism has much to do with conspiracy theory, and really we have the link to Edith and the era of science, and it's actual until now really important that. And you said in one other sentence that there's a specific of anti-Semitism in Germany as well, and because of the Auschwitz, sure. And you say some interesting sentences about this, and Yehuda Bauer and Wolkoff. Yeah, but now, and so I'm just wondering, how do you say, at the beginning you said, if I get you right, the term racism would disappear? Very at the beginning, you say it's so interesting for you to look on the racisms and different sentences about this.